Hi, Larry K, shadowanyone.com. What does a private investigator look like? Now, you can have a picture in your mind. As a matter of fact, think about what you think of a private investigator, what does he look like? Now, just the very question itself is leading when I say, what does he look like? We think many times of men as private investigators, although, and the majority of them are, it's a funny thing, but there are plenty of women private investigators out there, and the ones that I've met are very, very good. And in fact, the best investigator I ever had working for me was a female investigator. So immediately our image is kind of off a little bit. But when you become a private investigator, when you start doing this work, it is kind of cool, and you kind of want to carry yourself that way. And, when people ask you, what do you do for a living? It's kind of, yeah, I'm a private investigator. And people just love it. They eat it up. They want to know more about it. They want to tell you about how they want to be a private investigator. And it's kind of cool, and you kind of carry yourself that way, and maybe even dress the way you think a private investigator should dress. I had a friend of a friend who was a cop. He had been a cop for 20 years, and he told me one time, he said, I spent the first 3 years I was a cop trying to look like one, and the next 17 years trying not to look like a cop. And his point was that everywhere he would go, you just would know he was a cop. He just carried himself that way. Of course, he had the haircut for it, a department issue haircut, really. And it was just something that even in his off time, it was difficult for him to hide what he did, and it changed the way people treated him. So what does a private investigator look like? I'm going to tell you a story about a case, and I came in to follow up on this, but the investigator who ran it first loved the idea of looking like a private investigator, or of somebody who had some kind of authority. And he was doing a surveillance on like a little motel no-tell type place, and he was dressed the way it was described to me, like a SWAT team member, all in black. He had some kind of a dark body armor or stab protection on. He had the drop holster, the spare magazines. And he was sitting in the typical dark sedan. I wouldn't have been surprised at all if it had one of those little spotlight things on it to work. And of course, as he's sitting on this motel no-tell, people come out, management comes out, and they talk to him. And, he's kind of like, don't you worry your pretty little head. I'm a private investigator. I'm working a case up here on unit number 6, and you just mind your own business. Wow. Wow. Does anybody know that that's ridiculous? And of course, I'm coming in on the tail end of this now. Try to work a surveillance after somebody has done that type of thing. It's much more challenging. And in the Investigator's Ultimate Guide to Surveillance, I talk to you about why, when you go in, even if you're the first person, the first investigator, the only investigator, you handle it carefully at first, because if you're burned or they suspect, even if you're just hot, just that they suspect that you're there, it really changes how much you can do. And I cover all that in the course, of course. But, here's a guy who loved looking the role. He loved to be that guy. And for a couple hours or a few hours, he could sit in a car and pretend like he was somebody. But it didn't get the results. It didn't solve the case. It didn't help the client. It was just ridiculous. So when you're an investigator, I want you to remember, it's not about you. It's not about you letting the world know, what you can do. Your abilities are secret. What you can do is, your little secret. They should have no reason to suspect that you have the capabilities that you have, or that you can do what you do. And so I want you to remember that and act accordingly. You don't have to be out there. You might remember the story of David and Goliath. This is the little David up against the giant Goliath, the full-time professional warrior. Now David, of course, had been out. He had killed lions and bears. He wasn't exactly new. This wasn't his first rodeo, but he's going up against a trained warrior who had the armor and the helmet and everything else. Of course, David goes out. He picks up the 5 stones. He puts one in a sling, throws it, hits Goliath right between the eyes. The cat's dead when he hits the ground, okay? Here's the part of the story you may not remember, and I guarantee you is not in any children's book. David goes over to the dead giant, takes the giant's sword off his body, and cuts off Goliath's head with it, brings it home with him. So, yeah, that's not in the kids' books so much. But here's what I want you to learn from it. Goliath got his head cut off with his own sword. Don't you be out there trying to don't let your ego be your downfall. Don't let that be the sword. You carry this ego around like I'm something special, and then it ends up taking you down. It ruins your case. It makes it harder for you to get clients. And I just want you to be aware of that. What does a private investigator look like? Well, you know, sometimes you dress, coincidentally, I happen to be dressed today, kind of like what you might think a private investigator would dress like with the jacket. And sometimes we do because we want to give that air of professionalism if we're going to go interview somebody. But a lot of times we're dressed in just regular street clothes and we just want to blend in. So keep that in mind. This is Larry K, shadowanyone.com. Remember, do the right thing, even if it's the hard thing.